For a long time, I thought I was defective. I just couldn't seem to get my life together. It seemed like everything that I did or tried to do, whether that was making a living or building a relationship, inevitably fell apart. It was like I was trying to build my life on a shaky, incomplete foundation. And I was. I just didn't know it at the time. There's this saying that Oprah said, and I will paraphrase it badly. She said, life will give you signals. And at first it will nudge you, and then it'll nudge you a little harder. And if you don't pay attention, it'll smack you upside the head. Life had been giving me signals for a long time. And in 2017, the big smack arrived. I found myself broken-hearted, and rifling through my scantily furnished house, looking for something sharp with which to end my life. And in my frustration of not being able to find something, I went to the water, as I always do when things get too heavy. And there in the shower, in my tiny little shower, with the red floor and the warped door that could never close fully, I heard a sweet, small voice say, "You can come out on the other side of this." I couldn't muster up enough hope to believe what this voice was telling me. The months leading up to that night were riddled with anxiety over a toxic relationship that I was in that was leading to marriage, a new and small failing business, a move to a different town far away from my support system, and this feeling of dread that kept growing, that was telling me that this path that I was on was going to lead me to pain. A few hours before I ended up in the shower, I had been in the worst fight of my life. Earlier that day, my boyfriend's best friend had called me and asked me to meet him and my boyfriend at our favorite bar in Nakuru. He wanted to play mediator between us because we had been fighting a lot and were on the brink of a breakup. And so I met them, and over our favorite beers, we attempted to talk our issues out. And we got some things resolved. A bit later that night, I was happily and tipsily watching my boyfriend play pool with his best friend, and he motioned to the waitress to bring him a drink. As she walked towards him, I looked at him and I saw something in his body language. I can't explain it. I saw something in the way that he carried himself that let me know this man is cheating on me. And so back at the house, when we were getting ready for bed, and he was in that shower with a warped door, I took his phone and I opened it. He had recently changed the password. Before I used to have access to his phone, but I noticed earlier that night that he had changed the password. And with one try, I opened it. Let's call it divine intervention. I went to WhatsApp, and I didn't even have to go far. I found messages that confirmed his infidelity. I felt so many emotions reading those messages between him and other women. Yes, women, not woman. And by the way, this wasn't the first time that I had found out that he was cheating on me. I felt angry. It was like a white-hot rage. I felt sad. I felt hurt. But I also felt relieved because in that moment I understood what that growing feeling of dread was. On some level, I knew that this wasn't the right person for me. So he came out of the shower, sauntered into the bedroom, no doubt expecting an affectionate woman. But what he found was a heaving, rageful monster. We fought that night. We fought with words. I fought with my palms to his face. He fought with his hands pulling my hair and wrapped around my throat. I broke his watch. I broke his phone. He bruised my skin. I had so much pent-up resentment that had built up from years of feeling disrespected, cast aside, and not loved. He left later on that night, actually jumped off from the balcony. It was a first-floor apartment. When I came out of the shower, later on, I called my mother. And when she heard my voice, she said 2 words that would begin my healing journey. Come home. I went back to Mom's house with no money, no prospects for work, nothing. And I just sat with myself for 3 months. I asked myself some hard questions because I needed to understand why was it that other people could make their lives work but I couldn't? What was it about my life that couldn't seem to come together? And what was the root cause? Because for once in my life, I wanted to deal with the issue. When I sat with myself and I asked myself those hard questions, I realized that the cause of the cracks in my life came from my childhood. They actually began the day that I was born. So I met my parents in January 1985. I don't remember. But being an adult woman now, I understand that by the time that my parents were having me, they had lived entire lifetimes before that. And they had experienced things that would impact me. My mom was born in a large family. Her father probably had PTSD from being detained by the British. His only interactions with his kids were indifference or violence. My mom experienced emotional and physical abuse for all of her childhood. Her mother was a very petite, very powerful and stubborn woman. She had determined that all of her kids would go to school and that she would do anything to make sure that they did. But she was also cold, sometimes very mean, and detached. My mom grew up with very little affection in her life. But somehow, she was able to grow into a woman who would tell us that she loves us and had a very big, forgiving heart. My dad grew up in a larger family. His father was a chief who had 3 wives. And even though being a chief allowed him some status, their lives were still very hard. My father was smack in the middle of 2 very rambunctious brothers, and he was the good boy who his mother could rely on. His father was distant, didn't really connect with his children. And though I know less about my father's childhood than I do about my mother's, I get the feeling that he didn't receive as much affection as he needed. Yet my father grew into a very affectionate man who would tell us that he loves us and gave us lots of hugs and kisses. My parents are imperfect people. I mean, we have our ups and downs. We've gone through some things. But I know that they do their best, and I know that they want what's best for me. I have always felt loved by them. Because of their childhoods and who they turned into, I call them miracles. But these two people who I love so much, who are miracles, very imperfect, if I had grown up with them independent of each other, maybe my story would have been different. You see, when people come together, they come with baggage. And if they haven't resolved that baggage, they bring it into the relationship. And if these two people have a family, then that family is impacted by that baggage. My parents are wonderful people, but their relationship was toxic. A lot of things happened in my house growing up that I thought were normal because that's what I knew. It wasn't until I started to face things and ask myself some questions that I realized that those things weren't actually normal. It wasn't normal to have stony, cold silences between your parents. It wasn't normal for them to hardly have a moment of warmth or joy or affection or care between them. It wasn't normal for your father to constantly criticize and jeer and humiliate your mother. And it wasn't normal to have your mother shut down emotionally and be so cold and icy that she seemed impenetrable. On the outside, our family looked pretty perfect. I grew up in a middle-class family. I went to good schools. I had both my parents at home. We seemed healthy and happy. I was born the fourth of 4 girls. And people always ask me how it is to grow up in a house full of girls. And my answer is always the same: chaotic. On the outside, our family appeared happy and healthy, but on the inside, it was rotting. I grew up feeling emotionally unstable, never knowing when things would become tense between my parents. It felt like I was always on shaky ground, always trying to measure the energy in the room to see if things were safe. And that shakiness became my internal state, and I took it in. So, today we've come here to talk about trauma. And I know there might be some of you thinking, Taruri, what does your story have to do with trauma? I mean, you grew up living a pretty good life. Maybe you were just spoiled. And these are the very thoughts that kept me from dealing with the issue, because I didn't feel like I had a right to complain. But trauma isn't always overt. Sometimes it's subtle. And when I started to see myself repeating the same patterns as my parents did, I had to stop and look at my life and start to heal. I realized that in my relationships, I was mirroring my parents. I was dying for affection in the same way that my dad would from my mom. And I was being disrespected in the same way that my dad disrespected my mother. I was trying to look for safety in places that I couldn't find it. And so, I know that this story doesn't sound particularly traumatic. but it was for me. I spent the next few months after that breakup really dealing with myself and the limiting beliefs that I had I had absorbed from my parents. And because of that work, I have been able to find a career that I love, life coaching, and I've been able to stick to it. I am also starting to create healthy relationships in my life. A lot of our parents lived through very hard things. They were impacted by one of the worst times in history, colonization. And with that came a lot of trauma. So when I look around at how our parents were with us, even though we have common stories, it's important to know that a lot of it wasn't normal. My parents are no longer together. They separated and have built lives of their own now, which makes me very happy. My family is healing, slowly but surely. Each of us are finding our own paths and creating healthy lives. If I remember my Bible correctly, there's a part that says, the sins of the father will be visited upon the son. And that wording feels threatening, but I think it can be applied to trauma. If you don't deal with your unresolved trauma, you're likely to pass it on to your children.